Hi, everybody. It's Robert, your instructor for this political science class. We're going to talk a little bit about the presidency. There's going to be another PowerPoint that's posted about the Electoral College. I know the Electoral College is a little bit difficult to understand, um, but go ahead and take a look at that PowerPoint and then, try to see the significance in some of the faithless voters or faithless electors that are mentioned in that slideshow. Okay, let's talk a little bit about approval ratings for the president. So, approval ratings generally is a way that the media can gauge the popularity of a president. If we look at this website that I've linked up, uh, here are kind of statistical and historical approval ratings for each president. They roughly run around the same, anywhere from 40 to 60%. John Kennedy had a high of 70, and if we go through this, we'll see averages and stuff like that, and um, for second terms. So go ahead and take a look at this. This also shows the highs. Um, One interesting thing is look at George H.W. Bush, 89%. That was right after the invasion of Kuwait, and the UN and the United States' response to that. Look at Barack, 69%. That was right when he was inaugurated. And W, September 2001, was at a high of 90%. So, when we have some type of disasters or something happen, usually a presidential approval rating will go up. Here's the lowest. Barack was at 38%. George W. was 25%. Economic crises can affect approval ratings, and if you look at during this time, this was the time of the economic crisis and the housing bubble bursting, and George W. had a low of 25%. And if you go and look at traditional on the website here, it'll show you approval ratings as a trend. Look at Nixon after Watergate, everything fell. Ford was a little bit static. Carter fell. This was an economic problem also in our area where we had high inflation and high unemployment. Reagan was dipped and rose. We saw HW, same thing. Clinton, one interesting thing, if you see this little peak right here, this was at the height of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. His approval rating actually went up. So, very interesting statistic. And George W., right after 9/11, historically his approval rating went down. And here's Barack, stayed anywhere between 40 and 60%. Now, we look at currently at Trump, and it shows his approval rating. His most approval rating was hovering right around 42%. That was taken about a week ago. His lowest point was 37. This was during the government shutdown. Obviously, we can see that, and he's been anywhere from 35 to a high of 46 percent. So people are fickle. Approval ratings are it's not a exact or a definite a measure of how people feel about the president. It's obviously a poll, and some things out of it. So if we look at the 5 functions that a president is supposed to serve according to Fred Greenstein, you could see each of these. I think one of the things that stand out is the president is the symbol of national unity. And there's some couple of videos that were posted on the site with Reagan speaking after the Challenger exploded, and Barack talking after the Sandy Hook shooting, which I think are kind of, really good illustrations of these two, the third and the fourth points here on the video. That kind of, gives us a way of taking a vicarious action through the president, and the president kind of trying to calm the nation down, and the nation looking to the president to serve as a vicarious outlet. If you look at Reagan's speech that I posted after the Challenger exploded, he came across very grandfatherly, right? Letting us know that everything's going to be okay. Barack, when he was speaking about the Sandy Hook shooting, he came across as a father, right? So I think these are very important things. And probably the most important thing that the president has is the power to persuade. So get people behind your agenda, get people in line, and get people to follow how you the direction you want to take the country in. As chief executive, probably the president is the chief executive officer of the bureaucracy, kind of acts as the CEO of the bureaucracy, has the ability to issue executive orders. And what executive orders are laws that give a directive to the bureaucracy. So one example is Executive Order 9066, which was Roosevelt's order to detain and intern Japanese Americans right after the attack on Pearl Harbor. That was an executive order that was given to the bureaucracy to enforce. Same thing with Trump's travel ban. That was an executive order that was passed on to the Department of Homeland Security. These have the weight of laws, right? The president is also chief legislature. While they cannot really sponsor laws in Congress, that has to be sponsored by a member of Congress. They can definitely be in the ear of members of Congress and have them try to pass laws that they might have an interest in. They have the power to veto laws that the Congress passes. They have to give a State of the Union address each year. Well, let me back up. They are recommended to give the State of the Union address. It's not mandated in the Constitution. It's merely suggested. They're also the chief diplomat, commander-in-chief. The War Power Act was a really interesting thing that was passed in 1973, and you military people might recognize some of these powers. The president can send an armed force group to a military action for up to 60 days, and if they want to extend that, they need congressional approval. So a president can send a force to a combat zone for up to 60 days without congressional approval. After that, they need congressional approval. They're also the chief of law enforcement and grantor of pardons. As we know, the pardon subject is a very controversial issue right now, especially with some of the military leaders and the military individuals that have been convicted of some, crimes. And Trump has been looking into pardoning them, which has created a lot of controversy in the mainstream media and as well as in the military. Remember, a pardon is kind of like a get-out-of-jail-free card. It reinstates some of your rights that you might have lost when you are convicted of a crime. Even though the president isn't the formal leader of the party, they are seen as the informal leader. The vice president has been a traditionally kind of a limited role, where the vice president has generally just broken ties in the Senate, which is their main responsibility. But Dick Cheney's role in forming some of this policy was unprecedented. We talked about the veto power. It's really hard to override a veto. If a president vetoes a law, Congress has the right to check it by a 2/3 vote, but that's difficult for them to get. And if you look at kind of the aspects of overriding a veto, it hasn't happened that often. Take a look at a pocket veto. The president has 10 days to review a law that's passed by Congress. If the president doesn't sign that bill within the 10 days, it becomes law. If Congress adjourns during that 10-day, the bill is vetoed. That's kind of called a pocket veto. Okay, so when we talk about presidential power, there's some kind of schools of thought that go into looking at how a president should lead. Should they take a constructionist view where they can do only what's granted to them by the Constitution? Or should they do a stewardship view where the president can do anything as long as it doesn't or isn't specifically forbidden by the Constitution? Kind of two schools of thoughts. Executive privilege, where we've kind of seen this in the news where President Trump claimed executive privilege on the Mueller report, where it's trying to keep confidential communication from other branches of government. Impeachment, which we also heard a lot about, where the president and vice president are subject to impeachment, where the House of Representatives brings the charges and the Senate holds the trial, and you need a 2/3 vote to convict and remove from power. Remember, we've only had 2 presidents impeached, but none have been removed from power. So Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton were both impeached, but it was not. They were not removed from power. The president has absolute immunities from civil suits arising out of the execution of their duties. So a president can't be sued for actions that are consistent with their job duties. Now, if they do something outside their job duty, like maybe a sexual harassment case, they can definitely be sued for that. George W. Bush Talked a little bit about him. Some of the policies that he initiated, No Child Left Behind, the Patriot Act, which was, an act that was used in response to 9/11 to curb some civil liberties that we have as far as surveillance, the war in Iraq, the housing bubble burst, which is, if you ever want to watch a really good documentary, Inside Job, really goes into this and how the housing bubble burst in 2007. Talk a little bit about Obama. Domestic policy record was the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, an economic stimulus bill to kind of try to get us out of that economic Great Recession that we had in 2008, and also the fight against Al Qaeda and the killing of Osama bin Laden. So here is the executive branch and what it's made up of. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into the cabinet and when we talk about the bureaucracy. The slides also have a little bit about California, just for your information. We're not going to be testing on it, but just so that you know, kind of operates much like the presidency. And they basically have the same powers that a president will have on the federal level, but this type on the state level. So if you look at this, kind of the flow chart here, the president is the kind of the chief executive officer over the executive branch, and some executive branch offices down here. Okay, so we're going to do courts next week. Courts, bureaucracies, federalism, and civil rights. And that should tie up the course. Okay, and if you have any questions, please let me know.